Well, as the latest people sitting down, I want to welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen. Very welcome in this church. My name is Monique Knapen, and as director of the John Adams Institute, I'm extremely pleased we have Fay Weldon in our midst tonight. As maybe some of you know, the John Adams Institute is a lecture series with mainly American speakers. We only seldom, once a year or so, bring non-Americans to our podium. But if we do this for a very good reason. Well, I think you're here and you all understand why we have Fay Weldon in our program. She is an icon for so many readers, and I felt with the release of Auto Da Fay, the time was perfectly right to invite her. Happily, she's here, thanks to the publishing house Contact, who is responsible for the Dutch edition. In a moment, you will hear her talk. Before we come to this, I will have the pleasure to listen to Stine Jensen. Stine is a literary critic for the NRC Handelsblad and a writer herself. Stine will introduce our guest, and after that Mrs. Weldon will talk, and Stine will interview her here, and you are invited to ask questions too. And if you do, please use the microphones, because otherwise other people cannot hear you. There will be no intermission tonight, but there will be a book signing afterwards here. And I'm afraid I'll have to come back before we do so, because I will close off the evening and tell you some more details about upcoming events. But I will be very brief, and I will give the floor now to Stine. And I only have to ask you to switch off your mobile phones before I can ask her to come. Thank you so much.
Good evening and a warm welcome to everybody. When I was 17 years old, I had to come up with a reading list for my English class. And since I was an angry young girl, I refused to read any of the dead white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. Instead, I chose books with titles that sounded just right to me, such as Alice Adams' Superior Women and Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And of course there was Fay Weldon's The Life and Loves of a She-Devil, which was published in 1984. And actually it was my mother who pointed out this book to me, which at first, being a teenager, didn't sound like the perfect recommendation to me. But it turned out that, like my mother, I enjoyed the book enormously. And I have proof of it. I've taken it with me. Actually, this is a book report that I wrote at that time. And it has all the things you have to do, like the outline, the summary, the publisher, the passage I liked very much, and also my opinion. And there it is, I wrote, a fantastic book. It is funny, exciting, and very original. I think that Fay Weldon has a great fantasy. And there are 4 exclamation remarks to that. The book, which was also made into a movie with Meryl Streep and Roseanne Barr, gave Weldon large international fame and a steady group of fans, and I became one of them. And why was it such a success? I think because The Lives and Loves of a She-Devil was highly original, it was witty and sharp, and moreover, it was a deeply satisfying read for women. Because The Lives and Loves of a She-Devil tells us the story of Ruth, an overweighted housewife who is married to the handsome accountant Bobo and lives with him and her 2 children in a suburb. And when she discovers that Bobo is having an affair with, of course, a much younger and more beautiful woman, Mary Fisher, and she's more success, thin, gorgeous, Ruth, she feels rejected and longs for revenge. And she gets it. She destroys her husband, takes millions out of his bank accounts, and through plastic surgery, she even manages to become more beautiful than Mary Fisher. And in the last pages, we find Ruth, relaxing at her swimming pool. And beside her lies her new lover, an attractive young Spanish male. So good triumphs over evil, true love overcomes, and the greedy and evil people are punished. Now, I remember that putting that particular book on my reading list somehow felt like a really important statement. Not only because its message was so powerful to women, but also because of its style. For this was not the highbrow literature with endless sentences and difficult words, but rather an understandable read, with short paragraphs and funny one-liners. And interestingly enough, Weldon herself has attributed this writing style, which became her trademark, to the practical circumstances in which women like herself often have to write. When you always have children around, she says in her autobiography, the most you can do is to get 3 lines in between the crises. And also, I think it also has to do with the fact that Fay Weldon started her career as a writer in advertisement business. That's where the brevity of her style, her talent for aphorisms and effective puns began. The Life and Loves of a She-Devil is probably her most famous book, but it is just a fragment of her impressive oeuvre. And it is really difficult to give just a brief summary of it here. She has written so much, more than 25 novels, also children's books, short story collections, essays, television screenplays, and radio plays. And social comedy is her favorite genre. But although her novels often make one laugh, it is never an innocent laugh. Beneath the laughter, there are often thought-provoking, sometimes painful truths about the lives of men and women. She often writes about troubled marriages, jealousy, revenge, adultery, and usually written from the woman's perspective. And this turned Fay Weldon into a spokeswoman for feminist issues, a bit against her own will though, for she didn't want to become labeled that easily. In her novels Big Women, The Hearts and Lives of Men, and A Hard Time to Be a Father, Weldon surprised the audience with a change of heart. She started to write about men, who, in her opinion, had become the new victims. Feminism had gone too far. Now, in standing up for men's rights, Weldon surprised her readers, and in the years to come, she would continue to do so. 2 years ago, for instance, the art world was in a shock when they learned that Fay Weldon was sponsored by the Italian jewelry company Bulgari, who required that she mentioned the jewelry at least a dozen times in her novel. And so Weldon did, and with the Bulgari connection, she wrote the first sponsored novel in the history of literature. Now, opponents had feared that the freedom of literary speech would suffer from product placement. Would Bulgari, for instance, ever admit a passage in which a consumer gets killed with a Bulgari necklace? Or a passage in which the necklace is described as an ugly old thing? But Weldon wouldn't be Weldon if she didn't tackle this problem with wit. She blew up the Bulgari jewelry to cartoonesque proportion, mentioning the company practically on every page of the novel. And she herself got to wear the Bulgari jewelry. She wore a necklace worth £1 million in the evening of the book presentation. So it is no wonder that one gets really interested in the lives and loves of Fay Weldon herself. Who is this woman behind the fiction? Has she led the life of a typical Weldon heroine herself? Now we finally have the opportunity to find out for ourselves, because Weldon's last book, Auto Da Fay, tells the story of her own life. And there's a pun in the funny sounding title, which refers not to some Italian fancy car as I first thought, but also to the Spanish Inquisition, Auto Da Fay, which tortured confessions out of victims. And there's a serious undertone here, and so is there in Weldon's story of her life, which by no means has been funny or light-hearted at all times. Auto Da Fay begins with Fay in the womb of her mother in New Zealand. Weldon first portrays her mother, her father, and their fathers and mothers. Writing runs in the family, so we learn. Her grandfather, Edgar Jepson, wrote 73 novels, and her mother wrote as well. When Fay Weldon was born in 1931, she started her life with a boy's name, Franklin Birkinshaw, named as a diminutive of her mother's husband named Frank. The boy's name made Fay feel as if her parents had wanted a boy instead of a girl, and that she somehow had failed them. But her mother explained to her that she had calculated with numerology that the name of Franklin Birkinshaw came out the same as William Shakespeare. Fay was the name she preferred, but Franklin was used on her official documents, and it even got her accepted into a boys' school, where there really weren't any girls around. The marriage of her parents, however, was unstable from the start, and so Fay grew up among women. with her sister Jane and her mother. And when she was 14, her mother inherited a small legacy and returned to England. And after a short crush on a girl, when she was 10, she discovers the opposite sex. She falls in love with her best friend's boyfriend, meets a penniless busker, and becomes pregnant at the age of 22. She decides, however, that she doesn't want to spend her life as a plumber's wife in some suburb in London, and raises the child herself. Fay starts working in television advertising, and there she coins the famous slogan, "Go to work on an egg." Unzip a banana, and the sadly unused ad slogan, "Vodka makes you drunk quicker." And then suddenly something remarkable happens in Auto Da Fay. Weldon shifts from the first to the third person. In 1956, when she's 25 years old, she accepts a marriage proposal from Mr. Bateman, a schoolmaster 20 years her senior. Now for both it is a marriage of convenience. Fay wants to provide a home for her fatherless baby, and she soon discovers that to Bateman she's only a replacement so that he can make his job application seem convincing. He turns out to be a real bully. He doesn't want to have sex with Weldon, and unhappy as she is, she grows fat and becomes source material for her first novel, to be published 10 years later. In 1967, The Fat Woman's Joke appeared. Now, Mr. Bateman encouraged her to find work as a hostess in a strip club and to sleep with other men and tell him about it. And Weldon, hungry for some love and life experience, does so. He also makes her eat a raw egg on a holiday, and that's it. She takes her son and runs away. Now, shifting to the third person in an autobiography, as if it were a biography or a novel instead, has a deeply moving effect on the reader. It is a very effective way to convey a painful loss of identity. And from that point on, things seem only to become better. For when Fay is 29, she meets Ron Weldon, a painter, to whom she will be married for more than 30 years. And we briefly learn that they have 3 more sons together, and that also he left Fay for another woman after having consulted a psychoanalyst. He dies the day the divorce papers arrive, and later Weldon is to write a novel about this, Splitting. Auto Da Fay ends at the age of 32, when Weldon starts writing. What I do from now on, she says, is to get all the early stuff digested and out of the way. I write and let living take a minor role. But I do hope that there will be a second and maybe even a third part coming up, covering those years from 32 till present, those years in which Weldon wrote some of her most remarkable books, such as The Lives and Loves of a She-Devil. For life doesn't end at 32 now, does it? Surely Fay Weldon would agree with that, for in her novel that she published in the year 2000, Rhode Island Blues, she wrote a love story about the 83-year-old Felicity who falls in love again. And she is contrasted with her granddaughter, Sophia, who is 34 years old. And she is a so-called new woman who has a relationship with a married man and feels lonely. Casual sex is all well, but who do you spend Christmas with? She says in the novel. And it is from their life stories that we gather that aging is not the worst thing that can happen to a woman. On the contrary, life seems to get better, as the name of Felicity, meaning happiness, also conveys. Now, personally, I find this novel one of the most moving among Weldon's oeuvre. It is Weldon in top form, tackling with great ease the issues of love, sex, aging, and death. And I think maybe that one day, if I will have a daughter myself, this is the book that I will give to her, and when she is preparing for her reading list for her English class. But maybe she'll look at it and say, it's about old people. But then, of course, I will give her Auto Da Fay, to remind her that they too were young ones, and that they have stories to tell that can be funny, shocking, and heartbreaking at times. Now let me pause here and give the floor to Fay Weldon, the one you came to listen to tonight.
Well, it has been rather a disgraceful life, I think, when I hear it described in this way. Fancy having been that person. I'm not surprised I went I left the first person and became she at some passages in this novel. So would you, if you were me. It's really nice to be here in this city, in this church, in this place, with this audience. It feels actually rather more than I deserve. You sit there writing, and people respond in the most amazing way, and it's extremely gratifying. That said, I shall read you illustrative bits from this book. And try, it is true, people doubt it, they say, but is it true, or how much is fiction? And I have to say, well, actually, it is all true. There are other truths as well, but they're truths which are so excessive, really, they would not be believed. The difference between fiction and real life is that nobody believes real life, which is anarchic and full of coincidences and drastic. And if you do put real life into novels, put it in that context, nobody ever believes it. They think you just made that bit up. It's the same with doing research. I wrote a novel about, I wrote a novel. Please continue. I wrote a novel about cloning and actually did do some research for once. I don't usually do it, and discovered in Uppsala in Sweden a scientist who was cloning an Egyptian mummy. This was in 1988. No, yes, round about then. And I put this into the novel, and it was believed to be science fiction. It was believed to be totally fiction. It was, of course, true. The bits that I made up were seen as true. So I kind of lost my faith in research. In this book, I had to research my own life in a way. And if it occasionally seems unbelievable or too much is happening, it's because actually it is true. I think fiction is usually more close to the truth because you've filtered it, you've focused it, you've put a morality into it. I had to stop it at 32, partly because at the age of 32 I started it thinking I was going to encompass my whole life, but actually, of course, you can't. And also you are very reluctant to do that because you think when you come to the end, you will have finished, really, and you will have finished your life, and I'm very superstitious about this. And so the next part, should I read it? And it gets more personal, of course, because everybody's still alive, you know, and likely to approach you more than this stuff, which is really quite long way back in the past now. So I will have to do it in 3 parts, I think, and never write the 3rd part. But, and I thought Auto Da Fay did seem a very good name. Then I couldn't think of another title for the next part, but somebody said you could call it Phase 2. So I thought that would be all right. And the 3rd part would be fait accompli, you see. But I don't think I would ever write that bit for fear of finishing as I reach the last sentence of the last page. So that's going to have to wait. People ask me quite a lot why I wrote this. And I don't know what the answer is. So I give various answers, none of them totally satisfactory. Because I suppose in a way the book is going to be written because it exists now, therefore you've sort of got to write it because who else is going to do it? I do have that feeling about novels quite often, that there is a kind of inevitability about them, which is why you sort of are the one who has to write them. Anyway, I had many names during my childhood and early womanhood, actually. And I've gone back to that again. My writing name has ended up as Fay Weldon, but I have other names as well. Anyway, this is called pre-name because it's when I'm in the womb. It's how we begin the book. I long for a day of judgment when the plot lines of our lives will be neatly tied and all puzzles explained and the meaning of events made clear. We take to fiction, I suppose, because no such thing is going to happen, and at least on the printed page, we can observe beginnings, middles, and ends, and can find out where morality resides. Real life tends to fade out into entropy, all loose ends, and grief for what should have been, could have been, had things turned out just a little differently. Yet probably the life that was lived was the best that could be done, even to the outsider, better than could have been expected. This is an attempt to narrate a real life, my own, and to find the pattern within it. The pattern can't really be completed, of course, until death, when autobiography so rudely turns into biography, but so far as I can do it, I will. There seems to be a general overall pattern in most lives, that nothing happens, and then all of a sudden everything happens. You are swimming out to sea, you're rocking gently in the wake of a wave. All seems tranquil, but water is mounting beneath you, unstoppable, and suddenly you are the wave, breaking and crashing, sucking back into a maelstrom, and then all is tranquil again. When I was 3 months in the womb, in a period, no doubt, of nothing happening, except a general warm, all-pervasive dullness, an earthquake in Napier, New Zealand, had my mother Margaret running from the house with my 2-year-old sister Jane in her arms. The year was 1931. My mother was 23. Our house stayed upright, but the grammar school opposite and the hospital down the road, both made of brick and not New Zealand's usual wood, collapsed. Everything else seemed made of matchsticks. My mother, in search of my father, one of the town's few doctors, ran past the grammar school and saw arms and legs sticking out of the rubble. But with a small child in your arms, what can you do for others? Everyone else was running too, some one way, some another. The ground was still shaking and changing, and whether you were running into danger, into more danger or less, how could you be sure? But still she ran. All the water swept out of Napier Harbour that day and never came back. The town had to be entirely rebuilt and became the Art Deco gem it is today. Dr. Frank Birkinshaw, my father, was too busy with the injured to take care of his young wife. He was a man of great charm, tall, well-built, blue-eyed, and adventurous and impetuous, at the time in his mid-30s. Margaret was small, dark, fastidious, and very, very pretty, with high cheekbones, big brown eyes, and a gentle manner. The Birkinshaws were recent immigrants from England. He was from the north. He had joined the army when he was 16, been invalided out of the trenches, and qualified as a doctor in the face of many obstacles. She was a bohemian from the softer south, an intellectual by birth, breeding, and temperament. Her father a novelist, her mother a musician. She kept the company of Evelyn Waugh and his gang of friends. She was at home in literary soirees and in fashionable nightclubs, not in this harsh, pioneering land. But she was also clever, determined, and tough, and failing to find my father, she left word for him, and by nightfall she and Jane had taken refuge in the tented city that went up overnight on the hills above Napier. The town was uninhabitable. And then she lost my father, who didn't kind of turn up to rescue her and was gone for 3 months, and she had no word of where he was. It was there was no word from my father for 3 months. My mother became alarmed. He knew where she was. It was true that post-earthquake communications were near impossible. Civil structures had broken down. There was no working telephone system for a time and no post. But surely in 3 months he could have managed some kind of message. Perhaps in the second big shock the earth had swallowed him up. Perhaps he'd run off with another woman. Women were always after him. Perhaps he had amnesia and didn't remember he was married. Or perhaps this was just the way men were. She had no friends of her own age to talk to. The Birkinshaws had not been long in Napier, in New Zealand. She'd been too busy adjusting to pioneer manners to make friends. In London, people left calling cards in the front hall. Not here, where luxuries like hall stands were rare. The truth was hard to avoid, that here she was alone, penniless, on the wrong side of the globe, with no past, no future, just the shaky earth beneath her feet, and 2 children, one born, one yet unborn, and no one to look after them but herself. Pregnant, she must for the time being be dependent upon the comfort of strangers. But once the baby was born, somehow she would get us all back to London. there were advantages in having no husband. At least you could make your own decisions. In the meantime, she'd better make herself useful and help in the kitchens. She'd been taken in by a farmer and his wife and was helping in the farm. She had better make herself useful and help in the kitchens and try to hold her tongue when her host started rebuilding the cookhouse chimney just where it had been before when the last earthquake had made it fall down. It did not do for homies, immigrants, which is what we were, to put on airs or offer advice. She made mutton stew for the farmhands. Trim and cut the meat, brown in beef dripping, better than mutton fat. Add onions and carrots, stew till the meat is on the point of disintegration, thicken with flour, and serve. She learned to make the basic cake, which accompanied my childhood. She would write home, of course, though it hurt her pride. Margaret had married at 19 in the face of a great deal of advice to the contrary. A letter could go no faster than the ship which carried it, 5 or 6 weeks to get to London via Panama or Suez, and the same for a reply to come back. And supposing her husband turned up in the meantime? Well, anyway, he does turn up, but she comes back to England. The parents send her money. She goes back to England, and I'm born there. And then she makes a decision which her family thinks she should not, and she goes back to my father, who actually had found a job, but in a hospital as a doctor, but it was for an unmarried man, so there was no room for her, but she lived down the road. We're going to skip quite a passage, quite a time now, till I'm about 7, I suppose, 7 or 8, and we're living in Christchurch, New Zealand, and my parents are divorced, but they have neglected to tell me so, because nobody confided in their children in those days, who just sort of made sense of the world as it appeared to you. My mother, and she managed somehow to support us by painting bits of wooden furniture, by doing this, that, and the other, because the money that came from my father was not very predictable. And remember, in these days, there's no social security, there is no benefits, there's nothing like that. You live on what you can as you can. And she managed, this young woman, in the most extraordinary way. She was the most practical woman imaginable. I mean, she died a couple of months ago, age 95. And I remember when she was 85, the door slammed. She went out into the garden, the door slammed, and the key was in the inside. She was locked out of the garden. And she put her jacket over her arm and broke the window and opened the door from the inside, and then got a measure and measured up the window, took out all the bits of broken glass, measured up the window, wrote it down, went round to the hardware store, had glass cut to size, got the putty, went back, put the window back in, fitted it all, went inside, thought that was nice, went outside again to admire her handiwork, and the door slammed. And so she started all over again and did it, glad that she had actually kept the measurements and she didn't have to measure, at least she didn't have to measure up again. Anyway, that was my mother, who was still at it all these years later. I mean, she was a very uneasy woman to live with in a way, because no hardship was too great for her. She tended to invite it, we the children thought. So we lived in considerable poverty, I must say, but we always managed to have the New Statesman and Nation, which was the good left-wing newspaper, which would come through the war at sort of 6 weeks intervals. A load would come with every ship which managed to survive the torpedoes, and you would get piles of these magazines, which from a very early age I read. And if you're in New Zealand, the real world seems really to be Europe. You can't help it. My mother was losing interest in worldly matters. She had seen angels in Hagley Park. We're living in Christchurch, New Zealand, where once I'd held my father's hand and seen a parachutist floating down from a clear sky. Now she saw floating down pillars of light. The light spoke to her, reassured her. She was in despair at the time, she told me, as to what her life had come to, and ill, and anxious as how to keep us. But the angels told her all would be well in the end. She was special to them. I read a description in C.S. Lewis's Perilandra of just such pillars of light. He too described them as angels. They too appeared at a time of crisis. Such visions are both transfiguring and dangerous. The church is suspicious of them. Joan of Arc ended burned at the stake. And psychiatrists spend a lot of time and energy trying to explain them away, as they do point-of-death experience. Some neural disturbance, some hormonal imbalance, they claim. But I don't think so. I think she did see angels. And after that, nothing that happened, nothing she did or saw, seemed quite real to her again, as if she were living in shadow, waiting for the sun to return. Visions came to her from time to time, as if the sun came briefly out from behind the clouds. She described a vase of flowers to me once as it suffered a sea change into its proper self, floating with an intensity of being and beauty, before returning to its everyday self. She had glimpsed what Plato would describe as the perfect form, of which all mundane things are the shadow. It was the heaven even the nuns had spoken of. I went to the most terrible convent where I was terrorized by nuns. Heavens that even the nuns had spoken of, when it is enough just to gaze and adore in the light of the land. But I envied her for seeing such things. She had seen with her own eyes, clear and bold, what I only sometimes had just an intimation of, when landscape would turn silent and purposeful, or sunlight glitter on water, a flash of some glory only just vanished, caught out of the corner of the eye. It is not so fortunate a vision to have, of course, as my mother found. It sucks the vitality out of ordinary experience, and nothing ever seems quite real again. It isolates you from others. It is anathema to most churchmen who have no patience with it, and friends have no idea what you can be talking about. And then my grandmother came into our lives, Nona. Her marriage had broken up, as was customary in my family, generation after generation. The women were all artists, really, or pianists, or writers, and so were the men. And the men all believed in what was called the life force through the 19th century, which was actually and free love. And actually, it was an excuse for men to do exactly what they wanted in sexual matters and claim sort of nobility for doing it. In 1942, I became a granddaughter. My grandmother came over from San Francisco to join us. She came with trunks full of beautiful things, embroidered fabrics and beaded bags, delicate gloves and exquisite belts, a tall, elegant, gentle woman with a strong chin, beautiful eyes, upswept grey hair, and a flirtatious manner which New Zealand soon knocked out of her. This was a nation of practical, competent women in wartime. They didn't mind her playing the piano, but they didn't listen. She smoked, which was a male habit, and through a dainty little ivory holder. She made jokes which they didn't think were funny, and asides which they didn't understand. She wore little strappy sandals instead of sensible shoes, which was absurd, and behaved in her 60s as if she was still attractive to men, which was even more absurd. And she didn't bake. Her new compatriots were perfectly polite, but they left her alone. I think Nona was too stunned to be unhappy. She had not expected a country still raw with newness, bedside tables made of plywood apple boxes, a house which hardly had a mirror in it, or two granddaughters who spoke with New Zealand accents, and hardly a man in sight. She had not seen her daughter for 10 years, and her daughter no longer did as she was told. There was a brief power struggle between them, which Margaret, my mother, won easily, being by far the more powerful personality, and Nona settled down to being comfortable and making the best of things. Again, she had no choice. This was what her life had brought her to, and this is what she must expect. expect. She was meant to be looking after us, but mostly she played the piano and read detective stories. This suited Jane and myself very well. She tried to teach me the piano, but her attempts filled me with insensate and irrational rage. I have had great sympathy ever since with the reluctance of children to accept instruction from family members. It can drive you mad. Let strangers do it. Being taught by close relatives aggravates the child's sense of inadequacy and incompetence. I just could not bear the comparison between the way Nona's fingers tumbled over the keys and my own pathetic efforts. We both acknowledged it and gave up. Jane, of course, didn't and became quite a competent pianist, but the true gift was to miss generations before surfacing, and my son Nicholas, who only had to look at a piano to be able to play it, and now does so for a living. Nona was a great reader. We became complicit in this. She would read a detective story a day if she could. She trusted me to borrow them from the public library for her, and since it was assumed they were for my grandmother, not for me, I was allowed to take out these adult books. I read them after she had finished with them. I read Raymond Chandler and Agatha Christie and every green-coded paperback Penguin Books had to offer. I veered off into science fiction and read Jules Verne and Olive Stapleton, and then discovered H.G. Wells and The Time Machine, but Nona did not share my excitement over Wells. She said it was because she knew him too well, and nobody you knew well could you take seriously. In my mother's papers recently, my mother wrote a novel when she was 22, a very good novel called Via Panama, but she had just moved to New Zealand with my father. My father was standing for Parliament. And he was known as public enemy number one because he was a socialist, and now my mother with this book was known as public enemy number two because she had insulted New Zealand, or so they thought, or would describe New Zealand men as rather coarse and crude, and the women as forever baking cakes. And although these descriptions were probably fairly accurate, she was made to feel very bad. And in fact, it stopped her, I think, from continuing to write. She wrote romantic novels after that in order to support us, but good novels, somehow she was frightened, and she didn't try. But in her papers, we found a letter to my grandfather, who was the writer Edgar Jepson, and from H.G. Wells, and it was just a note, and she never showed us this, and it was a note which just said, "Dear Jepson, just read your daughter's book," something like "very fine, we'll be hearing more of her, no doubt, H.G." So, you know, that was H.G. Wells, and they all moved round in this circle of a circle of sort of literary friends when my grandmother was a young woman and my mother was a child and a young woman. And I was always regaled with tales of these these writers who I knew about, and George Bernard Shaw never slept with his wife because he was a vegetarian. And Rebecca West was known as poor dear Rebecca because everybody knew H.G. would never leave his wife. But we all wanted, I remember my grandmother saying, but we all wanted to have babies by H.G. With our beauty and his brains. And the old reply, well, what if the baby had your brains and my beauty from the man? And so poor dear Rebecca went and did it. And Ezra Pound used to come and play the piano with his nose when he was drunk. And that used to upset my grandmother. Anyway, it's all in this book. She was a pianist, and so it goes. And then one day my mother was left some money in a will just after the war, and took us all back to England in 1946, leaving my father behind because, of course, they were divorced, and she never reckoned fathers anyway, or thought they were of much importance. And we came to England which used up all the money, and to come from New Zealand, which was a comparatively comfortable and safe place, to Europe in 1946 was not a particularly good idea. which I was well aware of, but I just thought by that time, I was 14, I just thought they were all mad, really. And, with good reason. But anyway, we came to England on this hell ship with all the other refugees in the world. There was an amazing movement of population just after the war, as everybody got back home to the places, because people were just stuck when war broke out, and there was no civilian transport, and where it was like that game of statues. You stayed when the music stopped. You stayed where you were, and it didn't start again for 5 years. So we came back on a rather sort of hell ship journey, really, and with no money at all. That was my grandmother, my mother, my sister, and myself. I was 14, Jane was 16, and arrived in London and spent the night with friends, a friend of my mother. The house was in Bayswater and the only building left standing in what had once been an elegant London square. Jane and I were to sleep on mattresses on the bare boards of the front bedroom up the first flight of stairs. There was a full moon. It was a clear night. I was too excited to sleep. I looked out of the window at piles of rubble and the craggy cathedral shapes of half-demolished buildings. Cats yowled at the moon. I thought, I will get the better of this town. I don't know how, but I will. This is a brave city from which the bylines flow. That was the New Statesman and Nation. And its future is mine. It's in a parlous state. An enemy has tried to destroy it, turned it with their bombs into a mouthful of missing teeth. But this is London, and this is where I'm meant to be. The bomb site stayed for decades. Nature quickly took them over, the split-apart houses, wild willow herb and buddleia creeping over ruined walls. Family rooms were imprinted on slabs of brickwork, ghost-like, floor upon floor. Different wallpapers, the faded patch where the cooker had been. Once I saw a bookcase, still with books in it. The plumbing for the loo, half a staircase. Stray cats abounded, the ones who ran away when the bombs fell and never saw home again, or had no homes or owners to return to. Old ladies fed them their rations, and they bred and became plentiful, but weren't too keen on stroking. The world my mother knew had gone. 120 Adelaide Road, her childhood home, was a boarding house for refugees. The writers and artists had dispersed. Free love seemed a luxury. So did a world in which ideas flourished. Ideas had produced fascism and communism, thank you very much, and communism was still very much alive. But I had a family who sort of alternately, they always disapproved of it slightly. I was always disapproved of one way and another. My mother was disapproved of because she somehow hadn't managed to stay married and didn't care about money. I mean, I wished she would care rather more about money too, but never mind. Anyway, I got to university one way and another. I went to St Andrews and did economics, and then very soon went to the Badcock pregnant and had a baby without a husband. Then, little by little, came to my senses and realized that the world was real and you had to live in it and you had to look after what you were responsible for. And then took to this marriage of convenience in order to provide a home for myself and the child, because you realize in the end, I mean, it was hard in those days to earn a living for a woman in the best of times, in the best of circumstances. I had a degree, but that didn't mean there was any work for me. Work was usually being a waitress, and people would want to know where your stamps were, and if you said you'd been at university, they simply had no idea really what a university was, and they assumed you had been in prison, really, I think, because there were 3 years stamps missing from your card, and what had you been doing in that time? Well, goodness knows. And it's at this point, when I come to a passage in my life that I really can't somehow coordinate with my current life, that I turn into the third person, and I will read you just a little bit of this. And this is just before I become Bateman. And I'm referring to this person as Davies because the father of my child was called Davies, and my mother had made me leave my job at the Foreign Office, where I was becoming quite respectable, and change my name because of the disgrace. Well, not the disgrace, she thought it was an inconvenience to be an unmarried mother. It didn't really worry me particularly, but it did worry her, and so I changed my name to Davies by deed poll. I was always changing my name for one reason or another. Anyway, at this time of my life, I'm Fay Davies. It seemed to Davies to be party time, and I've got a job as a job as a barmaid. It seemed to Davies to be party time, and though she was meant to take money for the drinks, it was a barmaid in a literary club called the Folio Society, very sort of grand. Though she was meant to take money for the drinks she poured out from behind the bar, she forgot, because it was Christmas Eve. And soon all the dry sherry and the fine whiskey was gone, and the bar was drunk dry, and she was fired again. It may just have been that the job was temporary, but she felt fired. She got another job within the week as a researcher for Gallup Poll, standing on street corners, stopping male passers-by, asking them why they had chosen the ties they did. It was very cold, and most men hurried by, and those who stopped assumed she was accosting them and responded accordingly. So she made the answers up, or most of them, inventing names and addresses, matching the reasons given with the likely name, age, and address, correctly assuming that if she got it about right, no one back at the office would check up. She was promoted to head office on disclosing her qualifications. I actually had a very good degree in economics, actually. She was promoted to head office on disclosing her qualifications and sat from 9 to 5, fined an hour's pay if she came in 5 minutes late, setting up polls single-handed, realizing how much truer to life fiction is than life itself. You know about that already, I've told you. The wages were not good. Women's wages were pin money. She could not support her mother and the baby and herself on what she earned. There were often not 2 pennies to spare to work the immersion heater, which fed the bath, and besides, nobody was happy. Her mother was not well and exhausted from looking after the robust and energetic 2-year-old that Nicholas had suddenly become, and her mother, frankly, wanted out. Davies wasn't facing up to her responsibilities. She'd let her mother babysit all day and then all night as well. Davies would go to pubs, parties, and goodness knows what. Davies was man-crazy. Davies' mother was frankly pissed off with her. It was time Davies grew up, which in her mind still meant giving up, but not quite yet. Davies managed to get another job as a junior copywriter in a tiny advertising agency which specialized in small ads. She wrote copy for a foot product. Did you know that there are 200 tiny bones in every foot, and every one can be a pain? The newly started Institute of Contemporary Arts was in the offices below, and the first ever happening, forerunner of those cultural events which were so to entertain the 60s, took place in the room below. Naked girls bounced up and down on trampolines in the name of art, which later Davies realized was mostly by men and for men. Davies' problem was that she had a good deal too much love to offer and nowhere for it to go. Davies' current answer to her problems was to eat. There was a cafe round the corner from Dover Street below the brothels kept by the Maltese mafia of the day, where she could buy for next to nothing wonderful crusty rolls filled with ham, cheese, pickles, and so forth, which she remembers with delight to this day. Her attitude to food at this time is pretty much that of Esther in the novel The Fat Woman's Joke, the first one she ever wrote. To Davies' mind, all people now looked at her with revulsion, including her own mother, her child being the only exception. Babies were easier, mind you, when they just lay and gazed at you in adoration. Children were not simple. They had passions, feelings, went right or wrong at your behest. Children suffered, just as you did. The rent was overdue. She had spent too much money on filled rolls for lunch and tea. Her mother went on strike. No more childcare. And so on. She would have to get married and fast. She would donate her sexual and domestic services in exchange for bed and board for herself and her child. It was really no more than what the good girls did. Hadn't George Bernard Shaw likened marriage to slavery? The good girls could choose their masters, of course, and surround the bridesale with orange blossom and tulle to cloud the issue of the transactional nature of what was going on, but that was about all. It was she and her friends, the bad girls, the wild girls, who did not see sex as trade. They waited for true love and continued in the stubborn belief that though they lay down with wolves, they would wake up with lovers. And sometimes, just sometimes, it happened. But the great majority married where self-interest lay. Now she would do the same. She could not hope for much. She would not be spoilt for choice. She had a child, which suggested incompetence as well as loose morals. Even leaving that aside, it was a rare man in the days when fathers visited the nursery as a stranger who was prepared to take on another man's child. Why should he? He wanted his wife to pay full attention to his own children, not some other man's. That was why he toiled and struggled to keep her. Men and women, Davies could see, paired off in roughly equal groupings. The rich marrying the rich, the beautiful, her virginity in exchange for his earning capacity, and so forth. Frankly, she did not have much to offer in the marriage stakes. Davies did have a suitor whom so far she had tended to ignore. He was a schoolmaster in his late 40s, tall and thin, and already rather stooped and grizzled. He'd had a wife and son briefly, but was now divorced. The son had come ready-made, a stepchild. But they had vanished into the West Country, and there was no legal impediment to a marriage between herself and Davies. Would she consider it? And she did, and she married him, and it lasted 2 years, and then I ran off, and then I went into advertising, and things began to get better as I began to earn. Things always get better when you begin to earn. And then I met, and I'm going to read you the last bit, by special request, actually. 1963, I'm pregnant. I'm just married to Ron Weldon. No, I'm not yet. Am I married? Yeah, I'm just married. We were both delighted. Together we have our second chance. We got off to dicey beginnings, but it's going to be okay. The world opens up before us, full of new things and special delights. The world nearly comes to an end, actually, with the Cuba crisis, but we are reprieved. The quasar is discovered. The very first pictures are back from Venus. A Russian woman goes into space. The Christine Keeler scandal erupts. Martin Luther King has a dream, and Ronald Biggs robs a train. Harold Wilson is about to become Prime Minister, and I get bigger and bigger. I can't stop work. We need the money. I will never be able to stop work. We will always need the money, but that's okay. No one moves me off the egg account, or I'm doing egg advertising by this time, or bothers to replace my boss who died suddenly, and I was put in her place. I'm pretty much in charge around here at the advertising agency. That's fine by me. People do what I say because I so seldom tell them to do anything. Things move ahead smoothly. We now have our own TV department. We don't farm production out to specialist agencies. It's done in-house. It's not a very steady or stable department. People keep moving or being fired. Often there's only me to do the whole thing myself. Write the egg commercial, send out the film crews. Lots of money swilling about for other people. If I so much as write Arctic to describe the night in a script, the whole crew is likely to take off to the North Pole to film. They'd prefer it if I wrote tropical, and often ask me to. I do my best to oblige. It is part of the writer's duty, I discovered, to provide employment. They come back from wherever with the film, hand it over to me. I run it through the moviola, edit, cut, dub, put on the music. I do the lot. I have to, because there's no one else to do it. And there's a transmission date coming up, and no one seems to know much about that either. Pling plong, mother love music over mother, love that breakfast egg. Crack goes the spoon on the smooth curved shell. Caption, go to work on an egg. So long as you don't notice its technology and think too much about how women allegedly can't do this kind of thing, it's all quite easy. I take the finished reels round myself in a taxi without so much as an in-house screening. The more unobserved you are, I realize, the better the finished results. It's other people's doubts that hamper you. I'm not yet Weldon, I was still Bateman, until 5 weeks before the new baby, Dan, was born, when both our divorces came through. In those days, a private detective had to come round and inspect the bed for signs of adulterous sexual activity. Both of us consented to be the guilty party. No one asked us for any money, and we asked for none. When the detective came to inspect the sheets, it was a woman which surprised me. Odd, the things that women can do if they have to, though it's not the job I would choose. Our decrees absolute turn up in the post. Now we can get married. It's the middle of June. The baby's due in a couple of weeks. We go to the Camden Registry Office. Hetto Empson is there. I can't remember who else. It's a quiet wedding because people still tend to get married before they got pregnant, and I am very pregnant indeed. I can't remember what I wore. I expect it was some kind of voluminous silk caftan. We go to a Chinese restaurant after the ceremony, and I can't manage the chopsticks. I have a lot to learn. Ron puts half the house in my name. Now that's really something. The house and the things in it to his life. It's not yet customary for houses to be in joint ownership. Women can't even take out mortgages. Very few own property. I stay home to wait for the baby. My name is Weldon now, properly Mrs. Weldon. Birkinshaw, Davies and Bateman are behind me. I have moved into another phase. I wait and wait for the baby to come. It doesn't. It's very hot. June moves into July, and no baby. I can hardly stand up. I have to do something with my time. I write a television play. It's about a man, of course. Plays are at the time, but the women have all the best lines in it. I called it A Catching Complaint. Unhappiness is a catching complaint, I write, and misfortune is an insult to the fortunate. I can quote from it because I have a yellowed press cutting here beside me, found in an old photo album. Unlike novels, television plays are as transitory as the present. No sooner here than it's gone. I write by hand and get a friend to type the play out because of the embargo on typing in the house. Ron didn't like me using a typewriter because it sort of went clickety-clack and was too mechanical, so I had to write by hand. The sun streams in on the table on the first floor. Nicholas is happy and loves his school. Karen, she's my stepdaughter and 13 at the time, is being mysterious about her mother, who is back from Lima to kidnap her. Ron's description, or rescue her, his wife's. The baby has stopped kicking and fallen quite quiet, which they do when they've decided it's time to be born. I put the play into an envelope. I feel the same awe of it as I did of the story I wrote about a railway station when I was 11, and another one about Pompeii when I was 15. I know it has an existence outside myself. I simply deliver it, as a midwife delivers a baby. It's July the 18th, 1963. I call the doctor, who is startled to find I haven't given birth yet, and says I really have to go into hospital at once to have the baby induced now. It's been too long. I go to the hospital in a taxi. I can't get hold of Ron, who's meant to be decorating a house in Gloucester Crescent in Camden Town. I think it was Jonathan Miller's, and has left me his number in case I go into labour, but they say he has not come back from lunch. This is a bit worrying, because his painting partner is his best friend's girlfriend, blonde, a proper artist's moll, and I am now counted as a wife, and she is unhappy, but I am in no state to worry. I know he loves me. Karen, my stepdaughter, seems to be secretly packing, but I can't go into that now. I get the taxi to stop on the way to University College Hospital, where my father trained and where I am to have the baby. Put A Catching Complaint through the letterbox on the corner of Regent's Park Road and Primrose Hill Road, where later I was to kill one of my characters, poor, disagreeable Angie, in The Hearts and Lives of Men. And 3 violent hours later, Daniel has burst flailing into the world. And I am now thoroughly Weldon, locked in by motherhood, steamrolled. What I do from now on, all that early stuff digested and out of the way, is right, and make living take a minor role. And that's where, rather to the outrage of my publishers, I stopped the book and gave it to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. for your readings. Now let's talk some more about Auto Da Fay. Why did you choose to write your autobiography at this particular point in your life?
Well, because I was asked, really, and actually for some time my publishers had said, "Why don't you write your autobiography?" And I kind of felt I didn't feel old enough somehow, or I didn't feel I knew enough, or I didn't feel this was legitimate, and I said no automatically till one day I didn't say no, and that's the only reason I can give you. And because in a way it meant I didn't have to write a novel, I didn't have to invent anything, because I would use my own life really, so and turn that into a novel, and I could see that it fitted into the novel form perfectly well.
But was it different from writing a novel?
Well, it was sort of easier, really. I mean, it was more painful because it's you. So, and it is painful to go into all these memories, and not in the least therapeutic, because you just wipe a sort of the scar tissue off the top, and it all starts bleeding again. So yeah, but you have to put up with that. But it is, it's not so terrible that you can't put up with it. There were patches when I felt extremely sorry for myself, and I'd cry myself to sleep as if I was 8, thinking, poor little thing, but it didn't, that sort of goes with the territory, and you can do that when you're writing a novel anyway. So.
Now, in the beginning of Auto Da Fay, you write that we take to fiction, I suppose, because we can observe beginnings, middles, and ends, and we can find out where morality resides. Did you discover new things about yourself when writing Auto Da Fay?
Yes, I realized how much of my childhood I remembered. I had always thought I remembered very little. But it's astonishing how one thing leads to another. You either see a photograph or you remember a lesson at school. And remembering the lesson, you remember the teacher, you remember what school you were at, you remember who your friends were, you remember what you were wearing. Association will take you back. To give you an extraordinary detail of what a childhood looked like and felt like, of the textures, of the clothes, the ambience, the whole. What I did realize was how much we are conditioned by the decade we're living in, how much we alter as the society around us alters, how we learn, how we think we're in control of our lives, but actually we're the products of our time and our culture to such an extent.
As you say, one of the enjoyments of writing is that one manages to find a pattern in life. Did you?
Well, I thought I was going to put my whole life in when I wrote that, you see. So the pattern is still unfinished. But I saw, certainly you could see a pattern in the way your grandmother behaved to your mother, the way your mother behaved to you, the way you behaved to your children. And knowing that really didn't make much difference to how you behaved. But it is interesting to know it. It is interesting to see what a mixture of nature and nurture will do to make you just like your mother.
You said that in your novel you write that actually your fiction resembles that of your mother. You also like to entertain the reader.
Well, no, my mother, no, she didn't. She wasn't very funny, my mother. Now, much more like my grandfather. I mean, I never read anything that my grandfather wrote till very recently, actually, when I managed to get hold of some of the books, and I was surprised at the way my style resembles his. I mean, mind you, he was a classicist, as writers tended to be in those days, and so the language falls sort of rather gracefully in sort of groups of 3 is the only way I can describe it. And when I read what I write, I see that the same thing is happening. So it seemed almost that style is actually inheritable along with nature, or along with the genes that drive you to be a writer.
Were they also the ones that inspired you to write? Was there a certain event that got you into writing? I
think the event was a whole series of events. I think it was just realizing that there weren't any books plays written about women. They were all about men. I mean, women were not really seen as anything as central to literature. Men would fall in love with them. You could be Anna Karenina, and a bad girl, and have to be killed by a train in the end as a punishment for your sins. But or Madame Bovary, and you had to, and a novel would be about you, but it would be somehow all leading up to the fact that you had to take arsenic, you know. Whereas in real life, she would have had a wonderful time, I think, Madame Bovary.
You have been considered one of the leading feminist authors. Do you still consider yourself a feminist?
Well, I am the one, the true and the only feminist, and it's all the others that are out of step, you know. Well, yes, I have and remain primarily concerned with the interests of women, but I do not believe any longer that men are the enemy. I mean, men are there, but they're not the enemy. The enemy is a society, increasingly a society, and our own selves. It's not. You can't blame. I mean, there's an enormous amount to be done for women in women's lives. There's also a lot to be done for men in men's lives, but you know, it's not that you think they don't need attention, but the first phase of the revolution is over and was won triumphantly, do you see? But we can't go on behaving as if it hadn't been won.
But when reading your autobiography, the men aren't all that nice, thinking of your marriage to Mr. David.
But I think I was fairly terrible. I mean, do you know, I mean, I may think I deserve certain things, but I think he deserved better than me, really, honestly. You know.
One of the most moving parts in your autobiography is when you turn to the third person. Why did you do this?
Well, I turned to the third person because I couldn't incorporate the events of that couple of years into me. It didn't seem to be me at all, sort of living in this strange house in a very depressed suburb of London. It was very interesting. I discovered all kinds of things about the world, about society, about myself. But it was very boring. and somehow I suppose in a way I think I should have behaved differently. And
in what sense?
Don't. Well, I think I was driven by circumstances to behave to be what I was. But it was rather a relief to be out of the marriage and to be able to go into the first person again.
Interestingly enough, you decide to end your autobiography when you become happy, so to say. Why is it? Why do you end it at the age of 32?
Because it's because you know when these things happen, I put my first piece of writing in the letterbox, and I have a baby, and there's obviously trouble ahead of this marriage for this young woman, you know, and of which, as one is with a young woman, one is slightly blind, you know, you half see and half don't see, and because it seemed to be a good cliffhanger and a good time to stop. And anyway, I had written enough just about to satisfy my publishers, so, you know, why write on? You write the end to be continued and start on the next novel. Now on the next part of the biography.
So have you started it?
I started this morning, actually. I wrote the first before my first interview, which was 10 o'clock.
And what about your family? Have they read your autobiography? I understand your husband is present and his son. Have they read it?
I think my husband has read it. He edited it. My stepson certainly hasn't. I don't like my children reading anything I write.
Why not?
Well, I mean, it's an embarrassment to them. Why should they? I mean, they want mothers or stepmothers or whatever you are. They don't want, they don't want lady writers, writing about embarrassing things. It would be much better if they knew nothing about, I've always discouraged my children and my mother, but they've from reading anything I've written. They all do. I mean, I know that we pretend they haven't. What there can't be is any discussion about it. In actual fact, my older son, who's a musician, I wrote a novel called Puffball, which is about the birth of a baby and about an embryo, really.
Because they do appear in your novels. Your life seems to inspire your work a lot.
Well, no, it's invented. It really is. They but the children. The eldest son writes music and for this particular novel, and I used to go around with him, and I'd do the reading and he'd do the music. So it was fairly obvious he must have read it, but we never kind of discussed it. And the next son spent about 5 years writing a screenplay of the same novel, which finally is has fortunately just got off the ground. And we both had to pretend he hadn't read it, even though he was right, you know. I mean, it's a kind of strange sort of area in which you live, in which you don't quite admit responsibility for what you've done.
Now, there are also critics, of course, reading your work. Is it different? Was it different for you to have your own life sort of reviewed?
Yes, it was very different having my own life reviewed, and really quite difficult. I was sort of glad when I thought it was over. It's not over, because here I am still talking about it. But you kind of get used to it, and because it was in the past, because it is a kind of novel, it is not all that different to talking about a novel, really, except you just happen to be the protagonist. And it is, as it were, I mean, it is, and what you have tried to do is impose some kind of shape on it, although it is real life, which is, as I complain, chaotic and without point. But it is an attempt to give something a form, and I was lucky to be able to do it through the various names that I had for one reason or another, both first name and family names, as I got through the first 30 years.
Now, one thing I noticed is that you mention 3 times in your autobiography that you never got a literary prize. Is this something that bothers you?
Well, I have had some literary prizes. I've had sort of
you were on the short list for the Booker Prize once.
Booker Prize, yes. But I sort of didn't get it. And I'm I've sort of had Silver Pen Awards for this and that. And, you know, I got the Los Angeles Times Book Prize one year. You know, so things sort of, you know, think you do get the occasional thing. But I suppose I suppose really what one would like would be a sort of very profound and solid literary respectability. But I don't get that because my sentences are too short, do you know? And I make jokes. And the books which get taken most seriously, the books which the book which was shortlisted for the Booker, I went through before it went to the publishers and took out 2/3 of the jokes, you know. So it came over as a very serious book. Now, I could do that to many of the books, do you know, and they would end up very serious. And then they probably would win literary prizes, but there wouldn't be any jokes. And I would rather have the jokes. And I would rather have readers, actually. And I would rather entertain myself, in a way.
What is for you the meaning of entertaining, of wanting to joke all the time?
Well, no, it's not wanting to joke. You really just want to change the world. You want everybody in the world to think exactly as you do. You're a real power freak. And the way to do it is to trick people into believing you're joking, but you're not.
But I'm interested in why it is that you write social comedy.
Well, it's just playground habits, isn't it? I mean, it's when you're a child and you have, you know, you're in a rather hostile environment, which some of the time one was as a sort of immigrant child. You learn to entertain. You learn to turn family tragedy into entertainment for your friends, and it becomes a habit. I think, you know, you could say that.
Well, yeah. There's a lot of tragedy in your autobiography, a lot of troubled marriages also.
Yes. So
I was wondering, how bleak is your view of marriage, of how men and women can cope together?
I think they make a very good job of it, considering their natures.
And what do you think about the feminism sort of has changed? Now we have Bridget Jones, Ally McBeal. What do you think of the new path feminism has gone
Well,
in?
I don't think that's anything to do with feminism. I think, and the writing that we have today, I think that's more to do with publishing and marketing. And the idea, I mean, if you want to sell a book, you write it for the market, which has the money to spend, which happens to be young at the moment, to be young single women. And if there are enough books for them to read which are about themselves, they will buy those because it's a tempting and easy thing to do. If the books weren't available, they would probably read books about other people, other worlds, other existences, and that would be would be really good, but because they're provided with what they want,
So money
because they
rules
have
the
been
world.
focus grouped, this is sort of what they get, and it's a pity, but I don't think it will last for long, because I put great faith, I have great faith in readers, and in their, you give them something good, they'll read it, actually. I mean, they will put up with not so good books, or not so interesting books, if they have to. But they're always, it's just as with television programs or with films, once you saw some, or radio plays, anything, once you saw or heard something absolutely wonderful, once, and you go on turning on the television or the radio, or going to the theatre, hoping that you will repeat that experience. And it's very rare when it happens, but when it does, it keeps you there in the market, waiting and listening and hoping that something really good is going to happen again, because when it does, it's so wonderful.
Well, thank you for this interview. I would like to invite the audience now to see if there are any questions for Fay. Yeah, would you step up to the microphone, please?
Sorry about that.
I'm interested in your in your religion, in your belief in God. I don't know if you would speak.
Well,
about
I joined the Church of England about 3 years ago, actually, which in sort of bucking a trend, rather. But,
I wondered where it came from, because you haven't mentioned it in relation to your autobiography, and I heard you on Radio 4 a couple of weeks ago, I think, well, maybe more than that. And also, I think you attend a church that my brother sings. But it was interesting to me.
well, I think it's hard to live without a religion, I think, and since it is there, I think you had better you had better belong to it, join, and it's part of my background, part of my culture. Actually, my mother, although she saw angels, they were all rationalist humanists. They didn't, they thought religion was the opium of the people and all the rest of it. And yet they went to church, yet they sang hymns, yet they shared this common culture of what is, I think, beautiful in a society. I mean, it's the beauty of music, it's the beauty of language, it's the beauty of this extraordinary sense of something greater than what is ordinary. And since it is there, you had better take advantage of it.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes.
Perhaps a frequently asked question. Which of your books did you most enjoy writing? And are there any books of your own that you go back and reread yourself and enjoy that process?
I did reread one of my books the other day because I was visiting my mother and there's a second-hand bookshop and I went into it and he sold me one of my books for half price. And I had nothing to read, and so it was done among the women, and I was terribly impressed by it. I really was, and I thought, well, now there's energy. I mean, there is. What came out of it was this. It was a very early novel, and it was quite simple, in a way it was too simple. And I remember that I gave it. It was being published, and a professor. I knew nothing about literature. You must remember, I'd done economics. I knew nothing, and a professor of English literature, an American, actually moved into the house next door, and I showed him this novel I had written with some pride, and he read it with disdain, saying, "But this is not a novel." I said, "Oh, why?" And he said, "Well, there are 8 characters in the second paragraph. This doesn't happen in novels." and you could say, well, people read it. I mean, they're buying it, they like it, they seem to understand what I'm saying. But I did learn something from that. In fact, I learned how to. I listened very carefully to what he had to say, and then and a novel called Female Friends, which actually is owned by Penguin, who won't let it out and won't sell it, or anyway, it's a good novel, but lost somehow. But I do remember I got a great wall chart, and I made patterns on it, and I put in the names of the characters, and I sort of made this pattern of sort of relationships according to sort of his view of how things should be. And then when the pattern got too complicated, I put a little black dot in and stopped that line, which meant they died, you see. And I started to write this novel, and then the wall chart fell off the wall, and I just carried on writing, and it was fine. But, so yes, I do occasionally, this is the only time I have rewritten it. Mostly, you don't want to reread it. I mean, if you write novels, you don't actually, oddly enough, read them. You read from them, you read bits from them when they come out, and then you're on to the next one. So, no, I don't go over things. And also because I know the temptation to do what publishers would really rather like you to do, which is to rewrite the same novel over and over and over again, I kind of can't do or don't do or won't do or have forgotten how to do. The novel I most enjoyed writing, I think, oddly enough, was the Bulgari connection, because it was such fun, and sort of slightly delinquent anyway, though it was written for, it was commissioned by a company, like a piece of journalism, only actually it was a bit of fiction to be published, to be given away as a free gift, a limited edition copy, and with no prospect of being published in the outside world. So it was a sort of one-off, and you wrote it with such pleasure because there was going to be, so far as you knew, there was going to be no critical response, there were going to be no reviews, there was going to be nothing. You just wrote it for what it was, making it all sort of work, but there was no sort of baggage which went with it at all. It was just what it was, and I loved doing it. And then I showed it to my publishers, various publishers, and they all wanted to publish it. Because actually, it was just a novel, really, which happened to have been initially commissioned by a commercial firm. Though what people think publishers are, other than commercial firms, I don't know.
And what did you think of the fear that literary critics had about the product placement in literature?
Well, I didn't mind, really. They hadn't read it at that time, you see. I mean, you can't really take anybody serious if they haven't read the book, you see. So what they said, once the book came out and they read it, they were polite polite about it. And the fuss, and you can understand the fuss, because it is a real fear that you will somehow make people buy things or use literature as get it too involved with commerce. But, people aren't going to rush out and buy a Bulgari necklace for £1 million in that number, in any great number. So, you didn't feel you were actually getting money out of people. I was doing an honest piece of work for and you could have some fun with it, because it was about the kind of people who buy jewellery, who are not actually book readers. So when this book was published, was presented and put in Claridge's, where you go all dressed up with a borrowed £1 million necklace, which is quite fun, and there's this beautiful dining room with the chandeliers and the table setting, and this little black box beside every place with a scarlet ribbon on it, which contains your book. That's really rather nice, except everybody, of course, thought it was jewellery, and when they opened the box, they were terribly disappointed because it was only a book. And many of them left it behind on the table, and Nick and I went round and picked them all up and gathered them, and they're all collector's pieces now. So and so it goes. But it's all event, and again, you see, if the book exists, and if it hadn't been for all this, it wouldn't exist. So really, you can't really work out what they're worrying about or what they're talking about too much. Except, I think it is important. I think that the pressure publishers put on writers is quite severe now, to write books that will sell, and in a way, this is more sort of coercive and dangerous, I think, than actually sort of quite openly and upfrontedly using a product name. But I wasn't taking which I don't think I would do, I wasn't taking an existing piece of work and dropping in product names. because really nobody's going to make any money. Nobody knows, there are not enough people reading novels to make commercial sense. I mean, if you put a product placement into a film and the hero is wearing a Bulgari watch, well, people may might very well go out, and it would be worth their while doing it, but it is not the worth. It was a gift for a party, which is worth.
So you don't know if there's been more jewelry sold after you've written the biography?
I have no idea at all. I have no idea. I mean, I'd quite like it if there was. I mean, I don't mind much. I don't think it matters all that much.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question you kind of answered earlier when you said about you have faith in the reading public, that everything has to be, at the moment, is being marketed towards a genre. So for new novelists, it's coming up with something original at this moment in time is really, really difficult. Believe me, I'm trying. And they all want to know straight away, without anything else, they want to know what genre can they fit it into this certain thing. I'm being told, in fact, I got a letter from an agent yesterday, oh yeah, love your writing, really great, but you're too original. I mean, what's that all about? That is exactly what the agents
I
told
can
me.
believe it. There are an awful lot of peculiar agents out there.
This was quite a well-known agent.
Don't believe just because there are some very good ones too, but don't believe just because they say they are agents that they know what is what. And that is actually rather a silly thing for an agent to say. They should couch it. If they don't want to take you on, they should couch it in some other way.
Well,
or they will be exposed in public as they are now. It is, of course it is difficult. But then there are other agents. There is a kind of literary end of the market you need to go to. And
I'm doing the whole thing. I've got the writer's handbook and
yes,
everything.
I know, but the writer's handbook isn't much good.
No? Oh, really? Thank you very much
I mean,
for that.
in a kind of way, the writer's handbook will give you all sorts of advice, which is not necessarily right. Like, I mean, I've never read a synopsis or written a synopsis in my
Have you not?
life.
Never.
Well, that's what they tell you to do. Nobody in publishing reads the synopses because they just turn to the first page, and if it means
Start reading.
something, the synopsis can stand in the way. What you need to do is write the thing, finish it, get it absolutely right, and then take it to the best person you can find.
I'm doing that constantly. I've been doing it for a few months now, and all the questions.
Keep trying.
Keep coming. I have got a point to this. I have got a point to this about the future of fiction. That's
change
what worries
the title, change all the names, and send it out to the same people.
Well, there you have it. I believe we have one last question. Can I see how many? There's okay. One final question here. Yeah, for you.
I love your work. I have for about 20 years. If I'm not mistaken, I saw the BBC production of Life and Love She Left the Devil before the film. I'm curious what you thought of that film.
Well, I mean, the television version was very good. The film version was a sort of farrago, which happens to films sometimes. It had a good cast, but the director discovered she was 7 months pregnant when the film was sort of halfway through, and she didn't want to go on working in it, so they wrote in a few scenes. And Roseanne had an affair with the scriptwriter, and he had a nervous breakdown. And the whole thing, it was one of those productions, it was some time ago, and the company's gone bankrupt, and I don't think anybody will sue me, though it does say in my contract that I am not allowed to speak ill of this film at all, Yes, it does, doesn't it? And it's also in the contract, it said I had to agree to sell all the characters and the story in the novel throughout the universe for all eternity. And then I had to raise my right hand above the American flag and say that I was in my right mind. And I said, well, I'll sign that or I'll sign that, but I'm not going to sign both. And then I just didn't return the contract, and nobody noticed. So, I mean, it's mad out there. It really is. And, it sometimes pays off to be a bit willful about these things, and slightly delinquent, not always. But, you know, so the film was actually, in parts, it had scenes which were completely wonderful. It was just when you fitted them together, it was nonsense, you see. But then it was bound to happen. Then it is extraordinary how much money they can spend doing something that goes so terribly wrong, as that film did. Whereas the television production was really very good. The difficulty was that the film company bought up the television rights after it was made, which made and then charged an enormous amount. So nobody can afford to put out repeats of that television version. And it has, I think it has once, but you know, not really. So if ever it appears on your screens, you must video it once. Well, I made the money for selling it as film, but I didn't, you know, it wasn't vast, and I didn't write the script. So you know, you have no continuing financial interest in it.
Well, I can say, I think, for everybody from the audience that we are looking very much forward to part 2 and 3 of Auto Da Fay. And thank you very much for coming here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fay, for revealing some more of your, don't want to say secrets, but some more of your life. And thanks for sharing that with us. And thank you, Stine, for your introduction and your questions. Thank you, Contact. Thank you, Nielsen and Lam, for making this possible together with us. I know you're anxious to get your book signed by Fay, and you can in a moment. I only want to draw the attention to something completely else. There's a lecture this month with Robert Kagan. He is a neoconservative, I'm afraid, but I think he's one you should not miss. There will be a debate about America in these times compared to the European position towards many things. And it's on April the 23rd. So if you would like to come, make sure you get your tickets. You can make a reservation already tonight. You can also get more information about us, about the John Adams Institute, on the information stand just outside that door. I would also like you to ask you to fill out the questionnaires you maybe have seen. It would really help us if you could fill them out. Oh yeah, and there's also some more information about a lecture series on American literature I would like to draw your attention to. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you all for coming. Have a safe trip home, and I hope to see you all again later this month on the 23rd. Thank you.